How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another video. Today, we're going to be talking about Stegosaurus. The reason being, it is Stegosaurus Day, which is a little bit of an event that's put on by the Morrison Natural History Museum. It's an event that celebrates Stegosaurus as it was. Of course, it's one of the most iconic dinosaurs out there, and it's quite notable for a few different reasons. Stegosaurus is the state fossil of Colorado, so it's one that I'm quite used to seeing. There's all kinds of statues and fossils all over the place in Colorado, so it's like quite a significant dinosaur to me as well. Now, Stegosaurus was first uncovered around 1877. Uncovered in Colorado, of course, the holotype specimen was incredibly fragmentary, which means that it didn't really offer a lot of insight about the general anatomical appearance of Stegosaurus. But one thing was certainly clear: this was a different dinosaur. Like, nobody had ever found any type of dinosaur that quite looked like the fossils that they currently had. So it was automatically unique in that aspect. But of course, it was found during a point in time that's known as the Bone Wars, and during that point in time, there was a lot of unique dinosaurs found. But obviously, Stegosaurus is still quite a notable one. Now, later fossils were, of course, found, and we were able to get a better picture of the way that this animal looked. But the earlier reconstructions were still quite a bit different from the ones that we're more familiar with. Now, it was also noted that Stegosaurus did have these back plates, of course, that are known as osteoderms, bones that simply just grow in the skin. Now, the exact placement of the osteoderms were a mystery. That wasn't something that was known. It was believed that they would lay sort of flat on the back of Stegosaurus and kind of interlock and form what would almost look like a turtle shell. A structure like that would have looked like a roof, which is exactly what led to the naming of Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus translates to roofed reptile. It was thought that those plates were basically like a roof. Later findings found that this is not how the plates would sit on the back of Stegosaurus. A very good specimen of Stegosaurus found lying on its side showed that the plates were basically sitting vertically, pointing straight up to the sky, as opposed to laying down flat. Now, those plates are certainly like one of the most eye-catching things about Stegosaurus. As I mentioned before, they are known as osteoderms, which are bones that grow in the skin. Some modern-day examples of osteoderms include like the scutes on the back of crocodiles and alligators, as well as the shell of armadillos. Turtles do not have osteoderms because their shell is simply just attached to their skeleton. Osteoderms kind of grow independently from the skeleton, completely within the skin, which makes them very interesting structures. The exact use of these plates on Stegosaurus specifically are unknown. Like, we don't know exactly what they use them for, but the most likely scenario would be for display purposes, to possibly identify members of the same species, or maybe as like a sort of warning display. It is certainly possible that the plates would have had a different coloration from the rest of the animal's body, which would have been beneficial for a display, a display behavior. Other hypotheses include for defense. It makes it a little bit more difficult for a predatory animal to bite down onto you when you have that much armor. And of course, for thermal regulation, something that could potentially help Stegosaurus, warm up when it's cold or cool down when it's hot. But again, the most likely use would be for display purposes. Stegosaurus was a large dinosaur on par with modern day African elephants. It would have coexisted with other dinosaurs like Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus, or even Torvosaurus. It lived in what's known as the Morrison Formation, which was also populated with a plethora of sauropod dinosaurs. Its head was relatively narrow and sort of elongated. It would have had a beak at the end of its snout, and it would use that to snip at the low-lying vegetation, and then, of course, consume it from there, which is an interesting way to put that. Another very notable thing about Stegosaurus is, of course, that collection of spikes towards the end of the tail. Those are more osteoderms. Those spikes, they grow independently in the skin. They would have been relatively horizontal in their placement, kind of facing backwards. And of course, they have the fun nickname of Thagomizer. It's not an official nickname per se, but I have heard a lot of paleontologists call it that very thing because it's just fun. The reason why it's called a Thagomizer is because of this comic right here. A comic that was basically noting that this collection of spikes is called a Thagomizer because, it unfortunately it was it took out Thag Simmons. So it's just a fun name. Of course, it's not the official name, but it is fun. Now, these spikes most likely would have been very useful in defense purposes. As I mentioned before, other large theropod dinosaurs coexisted with Stegosaurus. So so there is decent enough reason for it to defend itself. There has been an Allosaurus fossil that has a hole in it that basically is the same size and shape of a Stegosaurus spike. So it's possible that that Allosaurus was unfortunately stabbed by a Stegosaurus spike. So that could be evidence that helps support the idea that Stegosaurus would use those spikes for defensive purposes. Another notable thing about Stegosaurus is that it does have throat armor. We often talk about the plates when it comes to the osteoderms that Stegosaurus has, but it does have what is known as gular armor. And of course, as you could probably guess, this likely acted as pretty decent, protection for the throat of the animal. Ever since its discovery, as I mentioned earlier, Stegosaurus has, quite a reputation. A lot of people do recognize this animal. It is easily one of the most recognizable dinosaurs out there, and likely what a lot of people will think of when they hear the word dinosaur. Of course, it's shown up in a lot of media over the years, all the way from Land Before Time to several different documentaries. Some of the most notable appearances include Spike from, again, The Land Before Time, the Lost World Stegosaurs, which actually look pretty decent for the time in which they were released. Like the posture of Stegosaurus in this movie seems to be pretty good, though I will mention that the placement of the head seems to be a little bit incorrect, and the neck seems to be a little bit too short. And they're obviously oversized, but they still look really cool, and they're really like some of the most iconic portrayals of this animal. Another incredibly iconic portrayal of this animal is the Stegosaurus from Walking with Dinosaurs. One thing that I want to note is that it's portrayed as being able to flush blood into its back plates to make them brightly colored. It was a fun idea, but I don't think there's really a lot of evidence to help support that, especially considering the fact that it would have been layered in keratin. So really, it's kind of unknown if that's something that Stegosaurus would have been capable of doing or not. Another documentary that it showed up in was in When Dinosaurs Roamed America. It has a fantastic design right here, and I really quite like it. The proportions seem to be pretty good. And more recently in the Netflix series known as The Dinosaurs. The head shape might be a little bit off, but overall, this was a fairly good portrayal. I like how visceral its fight with the Allosaurus was, too. It was very fast paced, felt like a real animal fight. And one of the most recent and up to date reconstructions of Stegosaurus will be from Prehistoric Kingdom, which is something that I am very excited to see. They're actually portraying two separate species of Stegosaurus, which is something that I have not mentioned yet, but there are multiple species of Stegosaurus known. In this case, in the Prehistoric Kingdom case, we have Ungulatus and Stenops. And to end things off, I want to talk about one big thing that often people do talk about when they're referring to Stegosaurus, that being the intelligence of Stegosaurus. Was it truly the dumbest dinosaur to ever exist? Well, its brain size is significantly small compared to the rest of its body size. In comparison to its body size, yes, it does seem like it was a relatively dull dinosaur. This also led many researchers in the beginning to believe that it had a second brain, because of course there was an opening towards the hips of the animal that was perceived as another brain for said animal. We now know that's not the case. That opening towards the hips was not an area for a second brain. Rather, it was more so just like for nerves to help like control the tail and whatnot. It didn't have neurons or anything like that. It wasn't an actual functioning brain like the one towards where the head was, of course, where the only brain was. So no, Stegosaurus did not have two brains. That is that's just a myth. It's a paleontological myth by this point that was never confirmed. As far as the intelligence of Stegosaurus goes, was it truly dumb? Well, we often think of intelligence, like intelligence is oftentimes relative. Like, was Stegosaurus on the same level as some modern day dinosaurs like corvids, like crows and ravens? No, probably not. But how intelligent did Stegosaurus need to be realistically? Stegosaurus was a dinosaur that was spending most of its time eating the vegetation that was plentifully around it, and defending itself from animals that wanted to take a bite out of it. And of course, it was breeding every once in a while. It's pretty important. So it didn't really need to do anything that was too complex or of the problem-solving variety. So while that might be considered dumb compared to some other types of dinosaurs that were obviously incredibly intelligent by our standards, I wouldn't really say that makes Stegosaurus dumb. It's just an animal that functions. It existed. So was Stegosaurus dumb? I'd say no. If I guess it depends on how you view dumb. I don't know. So anyway, that's just my little ramble about Stegosaurus. I just wanted to talk about Stegosaurus to celebrate the day. Happy Stegosaurus Day, everybody, and also have an awesome day.